The sun was setting over the horizon, coloring the sky scarlet gold. In the square, surrounded by street musicians and bustling passers-by, a lonely boy in a wheelchair sat by the fountain. His name was Elijah, and a mixture of joy and anticipation shone in his eyes. He admired the jets of water, not paying attention to the passers-by, who, absorbed in their own affairs, hurried past. Elijah was here to meet his father, Marcus Williams, who was late for a work meeting. Humming softly to himself, the boy glanced at the watch on his small but determined hand. He was used to waiting and never complained. Life had taught him to be patient. At that moment, the silence of his world was broken by the sure sound of footsteps. Out of the shadows cast by the evening light came a tall man in the uniform of a police patrolman. He walked slowly, with a hard stare, and stopped right in front of the boy. "Why are you sitting here?" The policeman's voice was cold and stern. Elijah raised his head and smiled politely. "Waiting for Dad, sir. He'll be here soon." But the policeman didn't appreciate the smile. His gaze flicked to the wheelchair, and then to the things that lay on Elijah's lap, a small backpack with the soccer team's logo on it and a book with a ragged cover. The policeman frowned. "Alone, huh? What are you doing here? It's not like you were waiting for someone." He stepped closer, hovering over the boy. Elijah felt something in the air change. The warmth of the setting sun was gone, giving way to an icy wave of fear. The passers-by who'd glimpsed him earlier now began to look away, slowing their steps. "I'm really just waiting for Dad," Elijah repeated, trying to speak calmly, though his voice trembled. "Let's see what you've got here," said the policeman, and without waiting for an answer, he reached into his backpack. "No, that's my stuff." Elijah instinctively clutched the backpack to him, his small hands clenched into fists. "Don't be impertinent, kid," the policeman said, not hiding his irritation. He snatched the backpack away, opening it in front of the crowd. Elijah wanted to scream, but his voice froze in his throat. He looked around at the passers-by, hoping someone would intercede, but the faces in the crowd expressed only fear and worry. No one wanted to get involved with the police. "And what are you stealing here? Maybe you shouldn't even be in this neighborhood." The policeman threw the backpack to the ground. His heavy boot kicked at it as if to show his superiority on purpose. Elijah felt tears come into his eyes, but he stubbornly held them back. He didn't want to cry. He just wanted to wait for his father. But things got worse. The policeman suddenly grabbed the wheelchair and pulled it back, making Elijah almost fall out. "Get up if you can," he said with a sneer, pushing the stroller to the side. Elijah found himself on the ground. The noise of the crowd turned into a muffled hum, and it seemed to him that time had stopped. People didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Someone pulled out a cell phone, filming what was happening, but no one intervened. Tears, which he tried to avoid, ran down his face, and it was at that moment that he saw a familiar figure in a military uniform walking across the square. His father, General Marcus Williams, had not yet seen what had happened, but that would soon change. Elijah was still sitting on the ground, staring helplessly at his overturned wheelchair. The policeman stood over him like an arbiter of fate, arms folded across his chest and gazing at the boy. His gaze was cold, without a shred of sympathy. I said, "What are you doing here?" He repeated sharply, as if Elijah's words had gone unheeded the previous time. The boy, trying to hold back the tremor in his voice, answered quietly, "Waiting for my father. He will be here soon." The policeman squinted, leaning closer. There was contempt in his grin. "A father, you say? Who's your father? Where is he now? Maybe you're just wandering around aimlessly like the others." Elijah felt his face begin to burn with humiliation. The crowd around him grew larger and larger. People stopped and looked at each other, some whispering, others pulling out their phones, taking pictures of what was happening. But no one moved. No one reached out to help. "My father is an Army general. He said he'd meet me here." "I'm waiting for him," Elijah said, trying to sound confident, even though everything inside was screaming with fear. The boy's words elicited a loud mocking laugh from the policeman. He straightened up and swept his eyes around the crowd as if inviting them to share his contempt. "An Army general? Really? Why, did your daddy send you out here alone, in a wheelchair?" "How thoughtful." He grinned, stretching his words as if he were talking to a little kid he thought was stupid. Elijah didn't know what to say. He'd always been proud of his father, of his accomplishments, of his strength, but now every word he tried to say turned into a new taunt. "Look, kid, I get it," the cop said, suddenly lowering his voice as if sympathetically. "Sometimes kids end up in the wrong place. Maybe you just got lost, or maybe you thought this was a place for beggars." "I'm not a beggar," Elijah snapped, his voice shaking, but he couldn't keep quiet. His words came out louder than he'd intended, and it drew even more attention. The policeman leaned sharply toward the boy, his face only a few centimeters from Elijah's. "Don't yell at me, okay? You think I'm here to listen to your excuses?" The crowd stirred. Some began to whisper louder, but no one interfered anyway. The phones kept recording, but it meant nothing to Elijah. He needed help, not attention. "Look at you." The cop glanced at his wheelchair and then at Elijah himself, scanning him from head to toe. "You're in a wheelchair, alone, and you claim you're waiting for the general. You expect me to believe that?" Elijah wanted to say something, but his voice was silenced when the policeman, as if to assert his authority, kicked the wheelchair, making it creak. "I think you're here for something else, boy," he said, straightening up again. His gaze was hard and penetrating. "Maybe I should check to see if you're doing anything illegal." Elijah felt a lump of fear rise in his throat. The crowd began to move closer, magnetically drawn to the unfolding scene. Some of the faces were worried, others interested, as if it were just a performance. The policeman suddenly grabbed Elijah's backpack and easily yanked it out of the boy's hands. "Let's see what you've got here," he said, glancing defiantly toward the crowd. Elijah tried to raise his hand to retrieve his things, but the policeman only laughed. "Take it easy, kid. I'm just doing my job." He opened his backpack and began rummaging through it, pulling out a book, a bottle of water, a small lunchbox. He tossed it all on the ground next to the boy carelessly and dismissively. "You sure you're not a thief, huh? Or are you just a loser?" He tossed over his shoulder. Tears finally broke from Elijah's eyes. He didn't want to cry in front of the crowd, didn't want to show his weakness. But the humiliation was too much, and it was at that moment that a low, confident voice rang through the air, causing everything around him to freeze. "Get away from my son." The policeman froze. The crowd simultaneously gasped and turned around at the source of the voice. In the midst of the mass of people, with a straight back and in impeccable military uniform, stood General Marcus Williams. His face was coldly calm, but his eyes burned with fire. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said, stepping closer. "Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether something similar has happened to you in your life. We want to know your thoughts and your experiences. If you like our stories, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. The policeman threw Elijah's backpack to the ground and frowned, as if deliberately delaying the moment. He looked around the crowd with eyes that read defiance. No one dared to intervene. Elijah was still sitting on the ground, looking helplessly at his belongings scattered on the pavement. The wheelchair had been tossed aside like an unwanted object. "So," the cop began with deliberate slowness, "since there's nothing suspicious in your backpack, let's see what's in your pockets." "It's not fair," Elijah shouted, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "I didn't do anything wrong." The policeman leaned over him, looming menacingly. "Unfair? Boy, you're lucky I'm even talking to you. Now sit tight, or you'll make things worse." He reached for the boy and roughly shoved his hand into his sweatshirt pocket. Elijah tried to pull away, but the cop held him tightly by the shoulder, preventing him from even moving. The crowd around him froze. People watched in horror, but no one even tried to stop what was happening. "What are you looking for?" Elijah squeezed out of his mouth, struggling to hold back tears. The cop laughed, pulling from his pocket the piece of mint the boy had been carrying. He held it up defiantly in front of the crowd, as if it were proof of some kind of guilt. "Here, look. I guess you were going to sell this, huh? Or maybe you're not only in a wheelchair, but you're also a crook?" The crowd stirred, some gasped loudly, some averted their eyes, but no one took a step forward. Elijah felt the wall of despair coming closer and closer. "You can't do this to me," he shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "I can do whatever I want," the cop replied gruffly, shoving his hand into the boy's other pocket. This time he pulled out Elijah's cell phone and grinned unhappily. "What? A toy for show-offs? He must have stolen it somewhere." "That's my phone," Elijah exclaimed, trying to reach for it, but the policeman held it higher, as if taunting him. "My dad bought it." "Of course your daddy," the policeman said wryly, pushing his cap back on his forehead. "Do you always call people you've never met that? Or are you just a good liar?" Elijah couldn't believe his ears. Tears began to flow down his cheeks, but he was angry at himself for this weakness. He clenched his fists, feeling rage mixed with despair. "All I did was sit and wait," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "Waiting, huh? How about you tell me why you're really here?" The cop stepped forward, staring hard into Elijah's face. "Maybe I don't believe you're just sitting here. Guys like you are always up to something." The words cut Elijah's heart. He froze, his breathing ragged. The crowd around him murmured louder. The cop's words were such a blatant display of racism that even the most passive of onlookers resented it. But again, no one dared to speak up. "What do you mean?" the boy asked, his voice hoarse and strained. "I mean, I see people like you every day. And you know what?" He looked at the crowd as if expecting support. "They're all the same." Elijah felt like the ground was shifting from under his feet. He looked at the faces around him, hoping to see one person who would say something in his defense. But no one met his gaze. Even those who were filming what was happening looked away when he tried to find support in them. The policeman, satisfied with his victory, straightened up and threw Elijah's phone on the ground next to his backpack. He took a step back, looking at his creation. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson," he said, smiling haughtily. "Next time, think before you show up where you don't belong." But at that moment, that same low and commanding voice rang through the air again. It was a voice that broke the tension like thunder. "Elijah, are you okay?" All heads turned to the man in uniform who stood at the edge of the crowd. His face was calm, but the look on his face said that there was going to be something much more than a simple conversation here. General Marcus Williams stepped forward. His steps were confident, and every glance thrown at him spoke of respect, even if people didn't know him. The policeman froze in confusion, losing his self-confidence for the first time all evening. The policeman exhaled irritably, his face twisted with anger. He had had enough of the boy's words, his attempts to explain and justify his presence. He stepped forward, walked over to the wheelchair, and grabbed its handles. "Since you're so smart, let's see what you'll do without that thing of yours," he said with a sneer and pushed the wheelchair aside with a strong jerk. Elijah gripped the armrests desperately, trying to hold on, but there was no strength. His body slid to the cold asphalt. He hit the ground with a thud, and the wheelchair rolled across the square, stopping somewhere in the distance. The crowd gasped. A few people shrieked. Some covered their mouths with their hands. But no one moved. Fear of power was stronger than compassion. "What are you doing?" Elijah screamed, lying on the ground, his voice shaking with anger and humiliation. Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't even try to wipe them away. "That's my wheelchair. Give it back." The policeman leaned over him, his shadow covering the boy from the light of the street lamps. "Shut up, okay?" he threw harshly. "Stop whining. Maybe lying on the ground is even more useful for you to learn respect." Elijah tried to rise, but his body refused to obey. He felt helpless, humiliated, and defenseless. He looked at the people around him, hoping someone would dare to help him. "Please, someone. Help," he whispered, almost losing hope. The policeman grinned, turning to the crowd. "What's up? Anyone want to intervene?" He spread his arms out to the sides as if challenging everyone standing around him. "No one?" "That's right." People lowered their eyes, trying not to meet his gaze. The woman in the green coat took a step back, and the man in the suit quickly hid the phone on which he was filming what was happening. "People like you think they can do anything," the policeman continued, turning to Elijah again. His voice was quieter, but no less threatening. "You think you can sit here, telling stories about your general father, and expect everyone to believe you? I see people like that every day, and you're all the same." Elijah struggled to lift himself up on his hands, his eyes full of despair and pain. "You don't have the right to say that. You don't have the right to do that." "What are you going to do?" The policeman interrupted sharply, stepping closer. "Will you call your daddy? Tell everyone how poor and helpless you are? Believe me, boy, nobody cares." Those words tore Elijah from the inside out. His arms weakened, and he fell to the ground again. He covered his face with his hands, trying to hide his tears, but he felt every look from the crowd like it was piercing him. You're not human," he finally squeezed out, not removing his hands from his face. "What did you say?" The policeman leaned over sharply, grabbing the boy by the collar of his sweatshirt and forcing him to lift his face. "Repeat what you just said." The crowd grew louder. People began to talk to each other. A few people moved forward but still stopped, as if an invisible wall of fear prevented them from approaching. "Let him go!" suddenly shouted a voice from the crowd. The policeman turned around, his face contorted with irritation. He released Elijah's collar, throwing the boy back to the ground. "Anyone else want to give me advice on how to do my job?" The moment lasted an eternity. Elijah lay on the ground, his breathing ragged and heavy. He looked toward his wheelchair, which stood far, far beyond his reach. He felt as if that wheelchair, a part of his life, a part of himself, had been roughly ripped from his hands. But suddenly, a man stepped out of the crowd. His steps were sure, and there was a flame in his eyes that made the policeman freeze in place. It was Marcus Williams. His tall stature and military uniform made him look like a living rock, ready to crush everything in his path. "What did you just do to my son?" His voice came out loud and clear, overpowering the noise of the crowd. The policeman turned around confusedly, trying to remain confident. "Who the hell are you? Go on your way, it's none of your business." Marcus stepped closer, his face an icy calm. "I'm a general in the United States Army, and this is my son." The crowd froze. The people who had been silent before whispered, their eyes fixed on Marcus. The policeman suddenly turned pale, his self-confidence beginning to melt away. He opened his mouth to say something but didn't have time. "And now you're going to be held accountable for everything you've done. Right now," Marcus said, his voice as hard as steel. The clatter of shined army boots echoed on the stone sidewalk of the square, as if time itself had slowed to match the footsteps of the man who had just emerged from the shadows. A tall, statuesque man in a military uniform moved confidently toward the center of the square. His gaze was as cold as steel, and his posture as perfectly straight as those of a man accustomed to command. Marcus Williams had just finished an important meeting with military commanders. His day was timed to the minute, but all he could see now was his son lying on the cold ground, humiliated and crying. In an instant, his face changed. The stern but calm expression turned into an icy mask of rage. The crowd, which a second ago had been looking at the boy with pity or indifference, now turned their heads toward the man, not realizing who he was. The policeman, who had just gone wild, did not immediately notice the approaching man. "What's going on here?" It was a low, deep voice that cut through the noise of the square like a knife blade. Elijah lifted his head and his eyes widened. "Dad!" His voice was shaky, but there was a note of hope in it. The policeman turned at the sound, and when he saw the man in uniform, he grinned, trying to maintain his self-confidence. "Oh, it's you," he said with fake friendliness. "You must be the general he keeps talking about." Marcus walked silently over to his son without looking at the policeman. He got down on one knee and gently helped Elijah sit up. His hands were firm, but they felt incredibly caring. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, looking his son straight in the eye. Elijah sobbed but nodded. "He took my wheelchair, pushed me." The boy couldn't finish because the tears were coming to his eyes again. Marcus raised his head, his gaze meeting the policeman's. If looks could kill, he'd be on the ground by now. "Did you do it?" Marcus asked, his voice low, but every word sounded like a sentence. The policeman tried to smirk, though his face became tense. "Look, I'm just doing my job. This kid was acting suspicious. Plus, he was getting cocky, so I thought I'd teach him a little lesson. It's nothing serious." The crowd froze. People were now looking at Marcus, as if waiting for his reaction. Some began to take pictures on their phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Teach me a lesson?" Marcus repeated, his voice a little louder and his tone colder. "Do you think it's okay to push a child in a wheelchair to the ground and leave him unassisted?" The policeman snorted, trying to hide his uncertainty. "You don't understand. Men like him, they're always hiding something. I have a right to check. If he hadn't started acting like a—" "Like who?" Marcus interrupted him sharply, rising to his feet. His height, posture, and form made him look like a mountain ready to collapse on his assailant. Finish your thought. Like who? The policeman hesitated. His gaze flicked to the crowd, then to Marcus. As a trespasser. Is that what you wanted to say? Marcus stepped closer, his voice louder and louder as thunder boomed across the square. Or did you mean like a black boy? The crowd gasped. A few people began to talk louder. The policeman turned pale. I didn't say that, he blurted out, taking a step back. Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance. You didn't say. But you thought. It was in every move you made, every word you said. You thought my son was a criminal because he was black and because he was in a wheelchair. You thought you could humiliate him because you thought he had no one to stand up for him. The cop tried to object. Look, I just... Shut up, Marcus said, his voice steely. You're forgetting one thing. That boy is not just a black kid. He's my son, and I'm an Army general. The crowd was murmuring louder now. People began to move closer, snapping pictures on their phones. Their faces expressed a mixture of shock, admiration, and anger. The policeman stammered and tried to justify himself. I didn't know. That's no excuse, Marcus said sharply. He turned to the crowd. Which of you saw what happened? How many of you stood there and did nothing? The men averted their eyes. Marcus turned to the policeman again. You are responsible for every action you take, for what you did to my son, for allowing yourself to overstep your authority. The policeman opened his mouth to say something, but Marcus raised his hand, stopping him. Now, don't talk to me. You tell your superiors, your internal affairs, and maybe the courts, because I'm not going to let this go. Marcus walked over to the wheelchair, picked it up, and handed it back to Elijah. Then, lifting his son, he placed him in the wheelchair as if he were restoring his lost dignity and strength. Dad, thank you, Elijah whispered, his voice weak but grateful. Marcus put his hand on his shoulder. This isn't the end, son. It's just the beginning. The square fell into a tense silence as Marcus began to call someone on his phone, clearly preparing for his next move. The policeman stood as if paralyzed, realizing that his career and reputation hung in the balance. The square froze. The crowd, hushed with shock, watched as General Marcus Williams, confident and fearless, walked straight toward the policeman. His gaze was intent on getting justice at any cost. The policeman, noticing the approaching man, straightened up and put his mask of arrogance back on. Now, what do you want? The policeman said with a cold chuckle, his hands in his pockets. If you want to complain, you can do it at the station. Right now, please don't stop me from doing my job. Marcus stopped in front of him, keeping his gaze on him. His voice sounded clear and confident. I'm a general in the United States Army, and I want to know what the hell are you doing? The policeman raised his eyebrows, his grin growing even wider. A general, huh? So what? Your Army uniform doesn't give you the right to interfere with the police. Marcus took a step closer, almost right up to the officer, his tall figure towering over him. Your work? The general emphasized each word as if each was a blow. Your job is to push a kid out of a wheelchair to the ground? Is it your job to humiliate him in front of a crowd? Is that what you call serving and protecting? The policeman snorted irritably, his face contorted with anger. This boy has been acting suspiciously, and I have a right to check. I don't have to justify myself to you, General. If you want to discuss it, go to the Internal Affairs Department. Marcus raised his hand sharply, pointing to his son, who was sitting in a wheelchair and wiping his face, still covered in tears. "That's my son. He sat here waiting for me while you—" Marcus paused to pull himself together, but his voice rang with rage. "While you treated him like a criminal." The policeman, unable to bear the direct accusation, crossed his arms over his chest and leaned closer. "Look, General, your son could be anyone, but when I see a suspicious person, I do my job." "Suspicious?" Marcus interrupted, his voice threateningly low. "Are you calling my son suspicious because he's black?" The crowd around him gasped. People began to whisper. Some started recording everything on their phones, moving closer so they could hear better. The policeman's face tensed, and he tried to pull himself together. "I'm not going to let you accuse me of racism," he said, raising his voice. "I was acting within the law, and you, General or not, are now interfering with my work." "Interrupting?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice icy again. "Am I preventing you from continuing to break the law?" The policeman clenched his teeth, his arrogance beginning to turn to anger. "You are exceeding your authority, General. This is not the Army. This is a police force, not you." Marcus leaned closer, his face only a few inches from the officers. "You don't realize who's in front of you. I'm used to taking responsibility for my actions, and you, as I see it, are used to hiding behind a uniform. But you know what? I will personally see to it that you answer for everything you've done today." The policeman took a step back, his confidence beginning to fade, but he was still trying to keep a straight face. "Threatening me? That's breaking the law, too." "It's not a threat," Marcus replied, his voice calm but steeled. "It's a promise." The crowd murmured approvingly. People began to applaud, shouting words of encouragement to the general. The policeman froze, looking back at the crowd, which was now clearly on Marcus's side. "That's enough," the policeman said sharply, straightening up and trying to regain control. "If you want to prove something, go to court." "I've already proven everything I need to prove," Marcus said, pointing to the men with the phones. "These tapes will get farther than you can imagine. Now put your hands up and step away from my son." The policeman hesitated. His gaze darted between the crowd and Marcus, as if he were looking for a way out. But there was no way out. The crowd applauded louder, showing support for the general who had shown that he was ready to defend his son to the end. Marcus took a step back and turned to Elijah. "Son, it's going to be okay. It'll never happen again," he said, putting a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. The policeman took a step back, but it was already clear. His authority was destroyed. His career was hanging by a thread. The crowd was no longer silent, and every phone in the hands of passers-by captured the final scene, which would soon become an example of the struggle against injustice. Let's pause for one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from and whether something like this has happened to you in your life. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. The crowd continued to watch as General Marcus Williams calmly, but with icy dignity, slowly pulled an identification card from the inside pocket of his uniform. The document was neatly framed in a black cover emblazoned with the Army crest. When he opened it, the golden letters gleamed in the sun, and everyone around him realized that it was not just some paper pass. "Look carefully," Marcus said, speaking directly to the policeman. His voice was steady, but every word was threatening. "This is a document from a general in the United States Army. Do you know what it means?" The policeman froze. His face, which a moment ago had been smug, began to pale. He squinted, as if trying to find some loophole to avoid admitting the obvious. "Well," he muttered, trying to keep at least a vestige of arrogance, "I see you're in the Army. So, what of it? That doesn't give you the right to interfere with my work." Marcus closed the ID card as if he were locking a cage and put it back in his pocket. He straightened up, his figure seeming even taller, his gaze burning through the cop. "My job," the general interjected, stepping forward. "My job is to protect this country, its citizens, and my son in particular, from the likes of you. You think you're invulnerable in your uniform? You think you can humiliate children because they don't look like you?" The policeman tried to hold the general's gaze, but his eyes flickered. The crowd began to whisper louder. Some were already speaking openly. "He's a real general," someone whispered from the side. "This cop is in trouble," the other added. The policeman looked back at the crowd, which was no longer neutral. He had to say something to regain control. He straightened sharply and pointed a finger at Elijah. "That boy was acting suspiciously anyway," he blurted out, trying to shout over the noise of the crowd. "He sat there alone, didn't answer my questions normally, and when I approached him he started to be impertinent. It was a provocation." "Provocation?" Marcus interrupted him sharply, his voice rattling across the square. "Provocation? You call insolence the words of a child who was merely trying to defend himself when you humiliated him? Do you call it provocation to have him here in the public square? Or do you just call it provocation that he's black?" These words made the crowd shudder. People began to speak louder. The whispers changed to outright condemnation. The policeman began to gasp, his face red with rage and shame. "I'm not a racist," he shouted, pointing at the general. "You have no right to accuse me of that. I was just doing my job." Marcus took another step forward, his voice sounding almost menacingly quiet now. "Your job?" This was not the fulfillment of a job. It was a manifestation of your bias, your cruelty, and your cowardly desire to feel power over those who can't fight back. The policeman fidgeted, his gaze drifting back to the crowd. He began to realize that he was losing control of the situation. People with phones moved closer, recording his every word and movement. "You don't understand," he shouted, as if in desperation, pointing at Elijah. "That boy looked. Finish it," Marcus said coldly, his eyes steady on the policeman. "What did he look like?" "Suspicious," shouted the cop, as if it were his only salvation. "I don't have to explain myself. I was following standard procedures." "Standard procedures?" Marcus repeated, his voice louder again. "Then, why did you push my son to the ground? Why did you take his wheelchair away from him? Why didn't you help him up? Are these standard procedures too?" The policeman began to stammer, his confidence completely gone. Just what?" The general didn't let him finish. "Just decided that a black boy in a wheelchair doesn't deserve your respect?" Now the crowd was no longer silent. People began to shout words of encouragement to Marcus. "That's racist," shouted someone from afar. "You should fire him," another voice added. "Where is justice?" shouted the woman. The cop was confused. He started to back away, as if he hoped it would just stop. But Marcus wasn't going to let him go so easily. "Your name and rank," the general demanded, his voice sounding like an order. The cop looked around, hoping to find support, but found only judgmental looks. "Officer Davis," he muttered, barely audible. "Louder," Marcus shouted. "Officer Davis," the policeman shouted, his voice trailing off. Marcus nodded, and his face turned icy. Good. Now you will formally explain your actions, and I will personally make sure that your report gets to every authority that will decide your fate." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. The policeman realized that he had nowhere else to retreat. He tried to say something else, but each time his voice was drowned in the noise. Marcus, without wasting another second, turned to his son. He gently adjusted the straps on his wheelchair, then put a hand on his shoulder. "Son, it's going to be all right," he said calmly. "This man will never hurt you again." Elijah looked at his father. There were still tears in his eyes, but there was hope in them. He whispered softly, "Thank you, Dad." The crowd continued to condemn Officer Davis, but now everyone realized that this story would continue. The phone cameras were still up, capturing every moment for the world to see the truth. The crowd around them began to buzz louder, as if a storm was brewing. People held their phones high, capturing every moment of what was happening. General Marcus Williams, with an icy calmness on his face, didn't waste a second. He stepped closer to Officer Davis, who now stood with a frozen expression on his face, and spoke loudly for everyone watching the scene to hear. "Get your supervisor down here right away, and have him bring a representative from Internal Security with him. We're going to handle this right now." Officer Davis took a step back, his self-confidence finally gone. He tried to squeeze out something in response. It's not necessary. We can work this out. Let's not draw any unnecessary attention." "Any unnecessary attention?" Marcus interrupted him, his voice rumbling like a clap of thunder. "You already drew attention to this crowd when you humiliated my son. You drew attention when you pushed a child in a wheelchair to the ground. And now you want to cover it up." The crowd supported the general with approving shouts. "Yes, call the chief," shouted someone from the crowd. "Let him answer for his actions," another voice added. Officer Davis attempted to calm the crowd by raising his hands. His face turned red and his hands trembled. All right. I'll call the supervisor," he said quickly, pulling out his walkie-talkie. The general watched his every move. He no longer spoke, but his gaze spoke more than any words. The officer was clearly nervous as he contacted dispatch and demanded the arrival of his superior. "The warden is on his way," he said, turning off the radio. He looked at Marcus, his voice weak. "Do you want to just talk for now?" Marcus grinned, but there wasn't an ounce of kindness in that grin. "We'll have a talk with your supervisor. Until then, I'll document everything that happened." He pulled out his cell phone and began filming the scene. The camera circled the disabled Elijah, still sitting in his wheelchair, the crowd around him, and finally stopped on Officer Davis. "This is Officer Davis," Marcus said into the camera, loud and clear. "He assaulted my son, who was in a wheelchair. He pushed him to the ground, took the wheelchair, and then humiliated him in front of a crowd, basing his actions solely on racial prejudice." "That's not true," Davis interrupted him, but his voice was drowned in the roar of the crowd. "I have recorded your every word, your every action," Marcus continued, ignoring the officer's objections, "and I will not stop until you are punished for your actions." These words caused a new wave of support among the people. The crowd became more and more active, shouting words of condemnation at the police officer. People began to move closer, surrounding the officer, who looked increasingly distressed. "Do you realize what you've done?" Marcus pointed the camera right at Davis. "Do you realize you pushed a child in a wheelchair? That's not just an abuse of authority, it's a felony." Davis tried to justify himself, but his words sounded pathetic. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was a mistake. I was just doing my job." "Doing your job?" Marcus moved closer to him without turning off the camera. "Do you think your job is to humiliate and intimidate innocent people? Or do you think you can do it with impunity just because my son is black?" The words hit Davis harder than a fist. He fell silent, and his face turned ashy gray. He knew that any answer he gave would only make things worse. At that moment, another police car appeared in the square. A man in uniform, with the insignia of a senior officer, stepped out of it. It was the captain of the department that Davis had called for. The crowd parted to allow him to pass. "What's going on here?" the captain asked, looking around at the crowd. His gaze settled on Marcus. "And who are you?" Marcus calmly handed the captain his ID card. He scrutinized it carefully, then turned his gaze to Elijah and Davis. "This officer assaulted my son," Marcus said in a flat voice. "I demand a full investigation into his actions." The captain frowned and turned to Davis. "Is this true?" "No, not exactly," Davis began to stammer. "He was acting suspiciously, and I was just trying to figure out—" "Suspicious?" interrupted the captain. "And that led to the child being on the ground?" Davis fell silent, not knowing what to say. The crowd murmured again, demanding justice. The captain, realizing that the situation was too serious, nodded to Marcus. "General, I promise we will investigate. This officer will be suspended for the duration of the investigation." Marcus didn't answer anything. He just looked at Davis and said, "This is just the beginning. You'll be held accountable for everything you've done." The crowd supported these words with loud applause and shouts. Davis stood silent, realizing that his career had just been ruined. Marcus turned to his son, leaned over and said, "We will get justice. You'll never face anything like this again." Elijah smiled through his tears and answered quietly, "I believe you, Dad." Marcus squeezed his son's shoulder tightly, turned to the crowd and said, "No one should be left defenseless in the face of injustice." The crowd responded with cheers of approval, knowing that they were witnessing not just a conflict, but the beginning of something bigger, a struggle for justice and equality. The next day, the video from the square went viral all over the internet. Social networks literally exploded. People from all corners of the country, and even from outside the country, watched a child in a wheelchair being humiliated by a policeman in front of an indifferent crowd, and an army general defending his son's rights with such firmness and dignity that shocked millions. Commenters wrote angry posts, shared their stories of police brutality, and demanded action. The hashtag #Justice for Elijah became a trend in a matter of hours. The video was broadcast on television, discussed on talk shows, and prominent activists and public figures began speaking out in support of the Williams family. However, along with the support came other voices. Some defended Officer Davis, arguing that he was just doing his job and that his actions were justified. Others tried to discredit Marcus, calling his actions over the top and an attempt to take advantage of his position. This only added to the tension and fueled emotions. Marcus wasn't about to leave the situation to public opinion. He knew that the fight had only just begun. "Dad, is this really going to help?" Elijah asked, sitting next to his father in the living room. His wheelchair was beside him, neatly cleaned after the fall in the square, but the boy himself still looked depressed. Marcus looked at him, his gaze hard. "Yes, son. We're going to make them hear us. They need to understand that no one has the right to do this to you or anyone else. And he kept his word. Marcus used his fame and the respect he earned through years of service to rally voices around his story. He gave interviews, spoke at conferences, and participated in debates. But, most of all, he was on the streets, among people who were hungry for change. The first rally was held in the central square of the city where the incident took place. A crowd of thousands filled the space, many holding placards with inscriptions: "Justice for Elijah," "Police for the people, not against them," "Racism must die." Marcus stood on a makeshift stage. Next to him was Elijah sitting in a wheelchair. The general raised his hand, and the hum of the crowd subsided. "Yesterday, my son was humiliated in this square," he began. His voice was loud, but there was not only rage but deep pain in it. He was humiliated by the man who was supposed to protect him, the man who had sworn to serve this country. But instead of protecting, he used his power to humiliate, intimidate, and remind us that racism is still alive. The crowd murmured. Someone shouted, "Shame on the police." Marcus raised his hand to quiet them. "This is not just a story about one bad cop," he continued. "This is a systemic problem. For too long, people like Davis have used their power, thinking they were invulnerable. For too long, they have looked at children like my son and seen them not as people, but as a threat." Elijah, sitting in his wheelchair, looked at his father with admiration. He had never seen him so determined and strong. "But we will not be silent any longer," Marcus said. "We will not allow this to continue. We will demand reform, demand transparency, demand accountability. And if anyone thinks we're going to stop, look at this crowd." The crowd exploded with applause and shouts of approval. People chanted, "Justice! Justice!" The rallies continued week after week. More and more people joined the movement. Representatives of human rights organizations, lawyers, politicians. Even those who had previously been afraid to speak out now found the courage to do so. At this time, Officer Davis found himself in the midst of a scandal. He was suspended from duty, but that was not enough. People demanded a trial and fair punishment. Davis himself avoided public statements. His lawyer tried to present everything as a misunderstanding, but it only fueled hatred. "This is not a misunderstanding," Marcus said at every presentation. "This is a reality that we face every day, and it has to end." The general secured a meeting with the city's mayor and police chief. He demanded not only punishment for the officer, but also the development of reforms that would change the system. He insisted on the mandatory use of body cameras, strict vetting of officers for racist beliefs, and the creation of an independent body to investigate abuse of authority. "You can't ignore it," he said in a private meeting, "because behind my back are not only thousands of people, but also the truth. The videos from the rallies, Marcus's speeches, Elijah's stories continued to spread. They resonated in the hearts of millions. Each new day brought more and more support. Marcus realized that they were only at the beginning of their journey, but he knew that they had already achieved the main thing. The voices that had been ignored before were now louder than ever. People were no longer silent, and he was sure that this struggle would lead to change. A few weeks after the incident, an official city police statement announced the decision. Officer Davis was dishonorably discharged. The results of an internal investigation confirmed that his actions had been excessive and unreasonable. However, even this move brought no real satisfaction to either Marcus or Elijah. They watched the news in silence. The anchorwoman talked about the police decision, showed archival footage from rallies and interviews with public figures. But Elijah, sitting in his wheelchair, was looking out the window instead of at the screen. His eyes, usually lively and full of energy, now seemed faded. "Elijah, did you hear that?" Marcus asked quietly, taking a seat next to his son. The boy nodded, but said nothing. "Do you realize that this is an important step?" the general added, trying to sound reassuring. Elijah silently gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His fingers clenched, white with tension. Finally, he spoke softly. Would it make a difference? The question made Marcus freeze. The question, simple and honest, hit him harder than any argument he'd heard at rallies or meetings. He didn't know what to answer. The man lost his job. Elijah continued, his voice full of bitterness. But he still thinks he was right. Does that make a difference? The other cops think the same thing. The people in the crowd back then just watched. They didn't do anything. Marcus wanted to object, to say that their struggle had already borne fruit, that thousands of people across the country were now speaking out about injustice. But he realized that words didn't matter to his son right now. "I don't feel safe anymore, Dad," Elijah said finally, his voice shaking. "Every time I see a policeman, I think about what happened in that square, and I don't know if anyone will ever do anything again." Marcus lowered his head. For the first time in a long time, he felt powerless. He could address crowds, talk to mayors and police chiefs, but he couldn't erase the fear from his son's heart. "You're right," he said finally, raising his head and meeting Elijah's eyes. "One dismissal is not enough. One rally is not enough. Even all the reforms we have proposed are not enough." "Then what was it all for?" the boy asked quietly, brushing away his tears. Marcus squeezed his son's hand. "Because we have to start somewhere. Because if we don't do anything, everything will stay the way it was. Because behind every step we take is not only us, but those who come after us. This is a struggle that we wage not only for ourselves, but for all those who will live after us." Elijah was silent for a long time, pondering his father's words. Finally, he nodded, but his eyes were still sad. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to normal. Elijah returned to school, but he became more withdrawn. He avoided talking about what had happened and flinched when he saw the police on the street. Marcus saw this and realized that the wounds left by that day were deeper than he had realized. One evening, he brought his son to that very square. It was empty, only the street lights illuminating the paving stones where the scene had taken place. Elijah tensed at first, but Marcus put his hand on his shoulder. "Why are we here?" the boy asked. "Because you have to see that a place is just a place," Marcus said. "It wasn't the place that hurt you. People did. And if you give them power over this place, you'll never feel free." Elijah looked at the square, his eyes full of memories. But then he took a deep breath and nodded. "You want me not to be afraid anymore?" "I want you to know that you are stronger than fear," Marcus replied. Those words began to slowly change something in Elijah. Slowly, he began to come back to life. He began to talk about what had happened without avoiding the memories. He began to realize that his voice mattered. A year after the incident, Marcus and Elijah spoke together at a national conference on police reform. Elijah, sitting in his wheelchair, spoke about what it was like to feel helpless in the face of injustice. His words touched the hearts of thousands of people. Marcus stood beside him, proud of his son who had turned pain into strength. They both knew there was still a long road ahead, but they also knew that it was a journey worth taking. It wasn't just their story. It was the story of many, and it was just beginning. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your opinion is very important to us because each of your stories helps us to see more and bring our content closer to you. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful to have you with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like if this story touched you. This helps us continue to share important stories. Write the phrase, "The fight for justice continues," in the comments so we know you're listening to our stories to the end. We wish you a good day and hope to see you again.